Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. For 2 decades between the United Nations Partition Resolution 181 and the Six-Day War, the Palestinians were either not willing or not able to establish a state of their own. They first gambled on nipping the State of Israel in the bud, then were under Jordanian and Egyptian occupation. It was only through the good services of Israeli governments that the Palestinian hope for statehood was rekindled. But rather than opt for peaceful diplomacy, they opted ultimately for violence and terror, with the added leverage of asking for outside pressure on Israel. Currently, this effort is once again focused on the United Nations, even while the Islamist Hamas and smaller gangs wage a terror war against Israel. What are the procedures and prospects at present in the rocky road towards a state of Palestine, if viably so? To analyze it, we're joined from the Kingdom of the Netherlands by Professor Uri Rosenthal, who formerly served as Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. It's good to see you, sir.
Same for me. Thank you.
It's a pleasure indeed. Also joining us from elsewhere here in Jerusalem is Dr. Neil Boms, who is a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. It's good to see you as well, sir.
Good to be here.
It's a pleasure. And with me in the studio, of course, our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, set the stage for us.
So in the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israeli narrative is, of course, that we are the few against the many. And indeed, the Arab world overwhelms Israel in population and size. In the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which is an inner ring, and some would say the core of the larger conflict, the Palestinian narrative is that they are the weaker party and that they need international support in order to even out the ratio of forces. And therefore, they have traditionally gone to world organizations and mostly the United Nations, hoping to get recognition and eventually to have their statehood, which, as you mentioned in your introduction, they did not get from their brethren, the Arabs, when they could have done it, when Israel was powerless to prevent it before 1967. So there are procedures in order to gain the official position of a state. Of course, and Professor Rosenthal is, of course, much better suited, as is Dr. Bones, than I am, to tell you about the attributes which nation states must have. And that is control of territory, borders, a capital. All of that is lacking in the Palestinian Authority, which is hardly in control of its own territory, much less of the Gaza Strip, which doesn't have a land border with the West Bank. So here we are, after Hamas, which does not even recognize the treaties between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, which established the Palestinian Authority. Hamas has started a violent attack on Israel, a massacre. And then the Palestinian Authority, which is supposedly the more moderate wing of the Palestinian national movement, has applied once again, for statehood and for membership in the United Nations. So it came up last month in April, will come again. The General Assembly is for it, but it doesn't have any binding force. It will go to the Security Council, and we'll see whether the United States will abstain, which will give it force, or veto it.
Indeed. Well, the last time, or the first time, the Palestinians attempted to enter into international fora, namely 1989, was when the Palestinian Liberation Organization, at the time their leader, Yasser Arafat, sought to enter into the World Health Organization, and the first Bush administration, namely Bush Sr., prevented that, threatening to end all fiscal support for the international body, emphasizing that there will be no arrangement unless the direct negotiations yield any tentative results. But with that being said, I'd like to ask initially Professor Rosenthal, right now, if we look at the Palestinian streets, we don't see much support for either Hamas or Fatah, for that matter. The most problematic element thereof is the fact that both organizations are deeply corrupt and only provide the basic of services to their own supporters and push international organizations to support everybody else. So, in other words, there is no viable economy, there is no viable structure, and all the attributes of an viable state are lacking, as Mr. Owen mentioned, but more so. According to the UN Charter, the only ones who are supposed to receive full recognition are peace-loving nations. And it doesn't seem that there is any loving of peace in the aspect of or at least a group that aspires to attain statehood with regard to its neighbor, namely Israel. So what was that attempt or the ongoing attempt by the PLO and Palestinian Authority Chairman Mahmoud Abbas to gain recognition, and how do so many countries fall into this trap at one hand, while at the other they promote adhering to a rules-based order that goes against the bid that they're actually trying to push?
Jonathan, this is a rhetorical question because you know the answer, I suppose. And it is for me already, right from the beginning, a real mystery how the Palestinians can actually have quite some success in convincing several countries in the world, member states of the United Nations, to go for Palestinian statehood. You have already said it. The Charter of the United Nations has the conditions two ways. First, you mentioned it already, peace-loving. And secondly, respecting the other member states of the United Nations. And there we go. Peace-loving, no. Respecting other member states, quite a question. And let me say, as an addition to this, that it is for me a extreme miracle that, for instance, a country like Iran can say openly that it is up to destroying, and annihilating Israel without being questions on that. Now, with regard to the statehood conditions, you have already mentioned it, and Amir said it too. It is competence to act. Well, competence to act is absent. Effective government, absent. And then also a third one, being independent, both internally and externally, to actually embrace the notion of sovereignty. And here you can also put quite some questions. Now, I remember when I was a Minister of Foreign Affairs, we had at a certain moment the so-called Quartet Declaration. You will remember it. And in this Quartet Declaration, there were indeed the elements, components for statehood, mutual recognition of Israel and the Palestinian Authority, secure borders, and for instance, when it is about the capital, which is also a condition, a negotiation on the status of Jerusalem. Now, all these three conditions are actually absent. That is one part of the story. The rest is purely political and a question of power. And here we go. When I look at the European end, to be brief on it, there is a prospect that by in a couple of weeks, I suppose May 21, at least 4 countries of the European Union, Ireland, Spain, Slovenia, and Malta, would take this step towards Palestinian statehood. Belgium is more or less in the offing as well. The High Representative in Brussels, Joseph Borrell, is pressing for it without understanding that it will be again a showpiece of a divided Europe, because some of the countries in some of the member states will definitely not go for this, will not follow suit on it. Let me keep it to this.
Indeed. Well, Josep Borrell, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy of the European Union, seems to promote more than once his own aspirations rather than provided by the European Council, which is the constellation of EU member state leaders. And therefore, it seems like he is promoting the splinters of a institution that is important on the one hand, but on the other hand is dysfunctional on so many fronts, unfortunately, and I say so. But let's turn now to Dr. Boems. I'd like to hear your perspective on this and point out two aspects to this. The first, the last time there were legislative elections to the Palestinian Authority, which was supposed to represent a body that would then in the future potentially lead to some sort of government of an entity per the Oslo Accords rather than a state, as was promoted by the second Bush administration, namely of George W. Bush. We see that the Palestinian Street back then voted 44% for the Islamist Hamas organization, which does not recognize any diplomatic solution with the State of Israel. Roughly 41% voted for Fatah, namely the PLO, which at the time also still had a charter that did not recognize a State of Israel within the boundaries, or any type of boundaries for that matter. And only less than 3% of the Palestinian streets voted for Salam Fayyad, who sought to promote a democratic process to statehood in peace and prosperity alongside the State of Israel, something that I do suspect remains within that context to date. Of course, with fluctuation between Hamas and Fatah, depends on the territories and the families within that support either organization for that matter. But how do you regard this within context of international efforts to bring about a reality that just doesn't exist?
Israel is stuck. We've been a small country that makes a lot of noise, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict being still, even within the context of the current war in Gaza, which has an unprecedented number of casualties on the Palestinian side in the context of what came before it. We have to remember that in 75 years of conflict since 1948, there were less Palestinians that were killed in compared to 1 month of a war in Syria. But still, the world, the international community, the number of resolutions that we see at the United Nations, at the UN, Human Rights Council, in all the discourses around parliaments around the world, in demonstrations, in college campuses and elsewhere, people are still obsessed with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And some of the world leaders are saying, well, we need to do something to bring it into potential progress. This is why you have the presidents of the United States looking at maps and trying to figure out what can be done or cannot be done in Rafah. I don't think it was done for any plans in Ukraine or in Syria or in Yemen or anywhere else. This is unfortunately part of the reality that this country is stuck with. And since there is not much of a solution and not much of a movement, then other things are being tried. And since there is sympathy and affinity often to the side that is perceived as weak, i.e. the Palestinians, then the world sometimes revolves into this notion that, okay, so we need to support something, and if Israel has not recognized a Palestinian state, then perhaps the world should. That's the basic dynamic that surrounds all of this discussion. Of course, as my colleagues have already said, there's three problems with the notion. One, a state's supposed to be a solution for something, not a part of a problem. And Palestinian state could have existed in 1947. It began to exist with a plan of doing so in the Oslo Accord in 1993. It existed de facto as the Palestine of sorts when Hamas took over Gaza in 2007. And of course, very little, by the way, of any solution. On the contrary, when the Palestinians were given, and they were given the territory of Gaza in the disengagement plan to manage their own affairs, what we have seen is the opposite of recognition of the other or ending of the conflict. So aside of this issue of effective control and respect for other nations and states, really the idea that stands in the core of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is the recognition that two-state solution, that the formulation that the Europeans and the Quartet endorse, which means that you have two states for two people, one recognizes each other. Israel had recognized with the different agreements the existence of a Palestinian polity, a PA, and eventually in some statements even a Palestinian state. We have not heard similar statements coming from the Palestinian side, certainly not from Hamas. And then the problem, whether a Palestinian state to be recognized by whoever is going to be recognized will be able to change course. This is a game of international statements and international law and international credence, in where perhaps the world is saying we need to give additional ammunition to the Palestinians and to Abu Mazen, who has been there as the eternal leader with a great succession plan. His father passed away in the age of 102, and he's only 87, so he's got some time. And because of that, that may be is a move that will do something useful. Problem is that there's no indication that any of this will help sort the conflict. One of the things that can help sort the conflict that the international community could do is really stick to, in some ways, its own formula, is help make sure that there's going to be a Palestinian side, perhaps now in Gaza when it needs to be rebuilt, that will change course and will think that the conflict is not the way to move things forward, and that the idea of recognition and peaceful coexistence is something that needs to be adopted.
Of course, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, back in 2009, when he also served as Prime Minister in his second term, has recognized two states for two peoples as the formula. Nevertheless, he did renege on that aspiration a couple of times since. But with that being said, I'd like to also touch base on the government, so to speak, of a Palestinian aspired state of sorts. Let's talk about Fatah and Hamas, since when Hamas took over Gaza, they basically killed their opponents in the Gaza Strip who refused to allow an orderly transition of government in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank districts under Palestinian control within Judea, Samaria, and the Jordan Valley. And something that was quite evident time and again, Russia and China in particular, the Egyptians are part of this, the Qataris are part of this, trying to mend the fences. There are blood feuds between Fatah and Hamas, and therefore many attempts were made to reach a certain understanding. All have failed, with the last prime minister of the Palestinian Authority, Rami Hamdallah, to visit the Gaza Strip, being subject to an attempted assassination with a roadside bomb, basically destroying and killing some of his personal protection along with his personal aide. It seems like the Palestinians are very far from reaching a certain reality on the ground that would accommodate their aspirations, but they're very comfortable in reaching to the international community and trying to convince them that the reality should be somehow created within the international fora for something on the ground to manifest.
So several issues which were raised by yourself and by our two distinguished guests. First of all, regarding the Hamdallah visit, it is not conducive to one's health to visit Gaza under any circumstances. Secondly, we are indebted to Nir Bohm's for reminding us that there are rulers in the Middle East whose fathers only passed at 102. There's another one in addition to Mahmoud Abbas. And thirdly, it all started with decolonialism. Of course, the Western powers left Africa and Asia and left the liberated peoples there to their own devices. And not all of the states which were created succeeded. We understand that there is a phenomenon of failed states. The Palestinian state would be a failed state to begin with, not as at the end of the process. Now, recognizing that, we have seen several efforts, first by George W. Bush, when he was the first American president to openly recognize a future Palestinian state 22 years ago, when he laid out the roadmap. There will be certain conditions which the Palestinians will have to meet, both internally and externally, in order to merit the position of a state. Then, under the Trump vision for peace, 4 years ago, again, what he declared was that in 4 years, here we are, 4 years after his vision, if the Palestinians meet these criteria, they will gain statehood. Of course, it never happened. And let me just remind you of another person, Condoleezza Rice. When she was the national security advisor for Bush, she took part in the policy right after Operation Protective Edge in 2002, which followed horrific terror acts. And when she became Secretary of State, she naively preached for what she called full, free, and fair elections in the Palestinian territories, believing, as you have asked, that Fatah and Hamas could form coalition, opposition, a parliamentary game. Of course, this is not going to happen in the Middle East, especially in the Arab world, and most especially in the Palestinian arena. However, by elimination, if you don't have any other solution, people are falling back on the two-state solution. And at least some people in Israel have lived to regret the fact that Jordan was left out of the policy game here, had the Hashemite kingdom.
For good reason, though.
Yes, of course, there are always good reasons.
No, because Jordan is leading the struggle for a two-state solution. Roughly 80% of its population is Palestinian, with the Jordanian identity of the 20% of the Bedouin tribes hoping to see this 80% moving back, supposedly back, into Israel or a future Palestinian state to try and maintain their own identity. Same goes for Lebanon, for Syria, for other countries who do not want the Palestinians part of their politics.
But a confederate form of government, a tripartite, Jordanian, Israeli, Palestinian, may have worked, but this is a lot of water under the Jordan River bridges.
Indeed. I'd like to have a short analysis. What do you expect for the near future on this front? Professor Rosenthal, we'll start with you.
Let me say that one of the points which I'm looking at the moment, apart from the countries in Europe which are pressing for this statehood for the Palestinians, there is a second point, and that is that the governments of Germany, the UK, and the Netherlands actually said last week that a full-fledged invasion in Rafah would really mean a game changer. And for me, it is quite intriguing whether these governments, which are supportive of Israel up till now, would indeed go ahead as well towards this development for a Palestinian state. I guess they will be wise enough, sensible enough not to do so, but it is a point of, it's definitely asking for attention. And for the second, very briefly, please look back at the Quartet Declaration, which was undersigned in 2011, United Nations, US, EU, and unfortunately Russia as well, which actually said exactly what could be done. And it was also related to the statement by then Foreign Minister of France, Alain Juppé, 2 states for 2 people. Thank you.
Dr. Bohms, last 45 seconds are yours.
The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is not going to be resolved by an international community decision to recognize statehood or otherwise. It's important that the international community will help to move things forward. But in order to do that, what it needs to do is help create policy that actually encourages the criteria needed for good neighboring relations to actually exist. Whether eventually it's going to be called a state or something else, I think it has a lot to do not just with the international definition of it, but with the actual realities on the ground. I hope that this is not going to be another phase in where we are just escalating a conflict rather than trying to do something that promotes its resolution.
Mr. Owen?
Whether it makes sense or not, it can happen. China replaced Taiwan. Vietnam, when the North occupied the South, then the UN recognized the reality. We may find ourselves with a Palestinian state and a member state of the UN.
My response to that is wishful thinking, but may is a strong word. This is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Professor Rosenthal, Dr. Bohms, and Mr. Oren. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next update from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.
My name is Doron Gavish, and my background, 30 years of serving in the Israeli Air Force. My last job, I was the commander of the Israeli Air and Missile Defense during the introduction of the Iron Dome to the defense of Israel. All of this allows me really to be part of the team here in TV7. It is super important to have such a platform. We talk about the global situation, we talk about Israel and those different angles which are relevant to the discussion.